Hello, everyone. It's a privilege to be here today to host the first debate on the valuation of esports. Today, we've got two very interesting groups of people debating what is the value of this sector. So, in order to chair this debate, I just wanted to spend a few minutes just outlining what we're doing today, a brief idea of the rules, and then we'll crack on with the main event. So this will technically be an informal debate between Newzoo and the authors of a research article recently published called The $1 Billion Myth. Both parties will be giving an opening uninterrupted statement of their perspective for approximately 3 minutes, and then we'll start the debate itself. As an academic journal, the International Journal of Esports is really focused on publishing the highest quality research in the area, and we're always interested in getting closer to the most accurate picture. It is a real privilege, and it's genuinely fantastic to partner with ESI Insider as our media partner to elevate the traditional series of letters we usually get in academic publishing to the more modern live debate we're having today, so that these groups can really thrash the topic out. So I'll give a short introduction to everyone here. We've got from the Newzoo side, Remer Rietkerk and Fabrice Zaumseil. And then representing the article itself is Joseph Arndt from Oxygen Esports, Seth Jenny from Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania, and William Collis from Becker College. Thank you very much for being here today. I hope we get through some really interesting material. To start off with, it's already been randomly allocated that Newzoo gives the opening statement, and then we'll proceed with Joseph, I believe, giving the response. And from then on, we'll start with a general debate. So please do start, Remer.
Perfect. Thank you, Aaron. So first, thank you for the invite to this debate. We're very excited to be here. And I also want to extend my appreciation to my colleagues from academia in taking the time and effort to explore what truly is the valuation of esports. This is it's a new and young and dynamic industry, and I think it's very important to take the time to have these kinds of conversations around what is esports, where do we put the boundaries of esports, and what it means. So from the Newzoo perspective, we define esports as competitive gaming in an organized format, such as a tournament or league, with implied competitive integrity and a specific goal, i.e. winning a champion title or prize money, and a clear distinction between players and teams that are competing against each other. And implied in this is very importantly that we view the part of gaming that is focused on formal competition with an audience as really what is the core of esports, right? And to us, this is what defines this segment of the industry. I know our colleagues on the other side have looked to sports to say, well, in sports, when you look at all of sports, you say that, well, the entire industry from amateur towards the NFL broadcast product is part of sports. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, esports is different from sports, right? There are some very key differences. One example being that in the case of video games and esports, there is someone who owns the underlying IP. There's an entirely different monetization and business model around that underlying IP. It's also fair to say that the application of traditional sports law in general to esports would not really work, right? You'd have issues around having international sport courts trying to adjudicate issues such as you saw recently in CSGO with the spectator bug, where they simply would not understand the issue at hand. Esports is young, it's dynamic, and it needs its own sort of set of definitions in order to really thrive and step into its own. We can learn from sports, but we should not seek to copy sports identically. And for that reason, we look to really clearly define this way in a way that we assert that we do in a way to be actionable. So thank you.
So please, can you respond to that, Joseph?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. Thank you for Aaron and Remer and Fabrice and everybody for joining us today. We're very excited to talk about esports because we love esports and we're gamers in general. Well, we kind of wanted to make this a Cyberpunk 2077 stream, but I was shouted down. Well, that's not true. Anyway, regarding what Newzoo said, we love what Newzoo said. To start off with, their work came out very early in this space, and it was actually helped shape the very esports industry. And so, in fact, their article was therefore a kind of a launching point, an inspiration for us to write this article. We wanted to approach it from a slightly different perspective, where when Remer said that this is a young and dynamic and growing industry, that's absolutely true. And it's changing very quickly. And it's starting to reach that point where it's becoming huge. And you can see that from that $1 billion of VC money pouring into this space every year. This space is enormous. And so we want to capture like what are all of the values and value chains that exist in this space. And so if I could summarize our approach in one sentence, it would say we try to figure out what is the GDP of esports. What is all of the value that's being generated around esports? And Remer's right. He says that esports is not sports. Absolutely true. There are huge differences. What we have to be careful about is exactly how it's different, right? We can't just say it's different and therefore no analogies apply. We have to know what analogies are still applicable and what are not. And in fact, what we argue is that unlike sports, the boundaries between a player and a professional and a streamer are far more eroded. The person who generates entertainment from esports, the person who plays esports at a highly competitive professional level, the person who is just excellent at home and plays on ladder and plays against pros at home, there's this spectrum and this very tight value chain that branches through and weaves together throughout esports. And so again, we wanted to look at the GDP, the interconnectedness of esports. And therefore, I can go to my definition. Our definition of esports was simply skill-based competitive video games in which humans compete against one another. And so our market size for esports attempts to capture all of the economic activity generated by the esports and therefore all the full business opportunity. And from this kind of economic perspective, we included, a variety of areas, including leagues and tournaments, the pros and the streamers, the digital tools, the products like the mice, my gaming mouse here, that you use to play at that competitive level. And we think that, basic things like player salaries, prizes, and streaming revenue should be included. And I mean, to the best of our knowledge, the Newzoo approach didn't include this. And so, that was kind of our launching point again in saying, what's the big size of this space?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Joseph. So just for the audience, in case you didn't read the articles, Newzoo believes that the sector is worth approximately 1 billion, and the authors of this article believe it's much closer to 25 billion. So they're almost a world apart. And this debate is really teasing out which is the more accurate number. So let's jump into the heart of the matter. And before we do, I would encourage the audience to participate, make some comments, and we will be selecting questions for the Q&A for the final 15 minutes. So please do fire the best you've got in terms of questions for the panel. So we'll start off with the main question that's obvious to everyone right now, which is what areas of esports should be included when coming to evaluation of the sector?
Sure, yeah, and I'll jump in here. I think one of the core differences that you'll find between our work and the work of our colleagues from academia is the inclusion of core game revenues, and that comes down to the concept that you can limit core game revenues for inclusion based on the concept of this being a skill-based, competitive PvP player versus player game. I guess one question I'd want to pose to my colleagues in academia, because they clearly outline what games are included and not included, is would you include, let's say, games with an indirect PvP element? So let's say time trials in a racing game, right? Just like in traditional sports you have, or even racing, right? You'll have time trial versions of sport. Would you include those types of things in your definitions for an esport?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think broadly, absolutely we would, right? And I'll give an exact example that I think we were thinking about a little over the course of this is something like speedrunning, right? To us, I think we would say speedrunning, incredibly popular, lots of Twitch streams. One of the reasons Mario on N64 still continues to rank up there, despite being like a 15-year-old game at this point. But, we view that as, like, it's not necessarily teams of people, but it is a definite form of competition, right? It's people racing for the fastest time. And that is just like, for example, sprinting, right? Or maybe even it's analogous to weightlifting. And I think Well, we would probably say, look, sprinting and weightlifting are maybe a different category of sport than, say, soccer or football. We'd still talk about them in sports, right? They still take place in the Olympics and other major events. So, yeah, I think we absolutely would put it in there. And I think that does speak to the fact that we do take sort of a broader definition of what an esport could and cannot be. But we think that's sort of accurate because what's really going on with esports is it's not the rise of League of Legends or Dota. It's the rise of gamers enjoying competition, getting competitive around their games, and for the first time ever, going professional based on their gaming skills. And if you can earn a career as a full-time speedrunner, just like you can earn a career as a full-time League of Legends pro, I think it belongs in that space. And I think we on the academic would say put it in.
Yeah, so I actually almost come at this from the other side because I'm aligned with everything you're saying. But the immediate flag that comes to me is then at what point do you stop including games? Because I've seen incredible competitions around speedrunning Half-Life 2, right? And that is a game of skill I've seen these incredible videos where they do the entirety of Half-Life 2 in like 30 minutes or something, right?
Yeah.
And they do it in a formalized competitive system. There's competitive integrity. There's rules to be eligible. There's a certain time limit at which, you have to beat. There's a goal and people go and they find new and better ways to do it. So it's a game of skill. It's competitive and it's PvP. So I guess the first flag I see is, do you not then just include the entire gaming industry? Or if not, what is that actual delineator?
Yeah, well, remember, I mean, you're sort of right to some extent, right? It's really hard. Like, at what point does any game cross over from just being something you get good at to a sport, right? But before I answer that, I'd sort of say, look, that's also a little bit the slippery slope fallacy, I feel, right? Like, just because it's tough to draw a line somewhere, like, is Half-Life speedrunning an esport? Like, yeah, it could be a gray area, right? But there are some things that I think clearly fit in, right? So League of Legends, for example. I think if you ask anybody who plays League of Legends today, are you playing an esport? They would say yes, right? And I also think if you ask somebody, do you think League of Legends is part of the esports market? I think a lot of people would say, absolutely. It's one of the most important parts of the market. And so, for us, we think including games that are obviously esports is a pretty good place to start. And that's effectively what we did with our market sizing. We didn't just put in the entire video games industry. If we did, that would be, obviously an even much larger number. But we included the titles that people would think and the revenues associated that people would think are mainly traditional esports today. Dota, League, StarCraft 2, things like that. And we can have a debate about the methodology we use to include versus exclude. For us, we sort of said there has to be an intent on the part of the publisher to at least partially monetize the game through viewership, right? So the response we'd have about why we don't put Half-Life 2 in there is, well, because Valve isn't really trying to monetize Half-Life 2 as an esport. They're not doing active activities to turn viewership of that into a revenue stream for Valve. Whereas in League of Legends, 100%, as you know, Remer, because you were pivotal, I think, in some of the foundations of things like the LCS, right? Like the LCS is absolutely a revenue stream for Riot. So it's tough. I agree with you. It really is tough where to draw the line, but that doesn't mean, we think that doesn't mean you shouldn't draw a line at all. We think some games, and at least the big obvious games, belong in the market size.
I mean, I would make the counterpoint that, Valve famously does not make an effort to monetize through viewership CSGO, right? Counter-Strike is the abandoned child of Valve, while still being perhaps one of the big three pivotal esports, right? And that's driven by its community entirely. And Valve does not really seek to capitalize on it. And it's actually recently been a point of chagrin in the community as they see other more involved publishers. I mean, I hear and respect that opinion, but to my view, it's that at the end, what you're doing is you're capturing parts of the underlying games market and establishing what I would view to some degree as arbitrary lines, because I think there is no definition that separates it well, to my mind, right? If I consider the market, if you say, for example, with the intent of monetizing the viewership, you can point to CSGO, which I think we all agree as a game is an esport. It is played as an esport. It has one of the key thriving esports scenes globally, and is not pushed by its publisher as an esport, right? And does not seek to monetize its viewership by the publisher or developer. And then if you say the flip side, that it requires some competitive basis, and maybe you say it is a slippery slope fallacy, but it does really provide some real questions, because if you go on the other say of competitive basis, almost any game can be made competitive and be meaningfully competitive, and from my perspective, in some ways, you'd almost look at the better equating sports to esports perhaps is more false than equating, is more of a false like equivalency, and perhaps the true equivalency is sports to games, right? Because I would say a lot of esports activity, you could argue, is captured under the games industry, right? But I would not capture the games industry under the esports umbrella. And perhaps to our mind, when you look at if you were to make an equivalency, it's the broadcast media sports that is what esports is to our perspective.
Let me add on to what William said. So, you know, when we look at the way, first of all, we appreciate that you all actually defined esports in your report, because there's a number of people that looked at the paper, our paper, and they just said, "Oh, this is a load of crap," because you know, probably they had a problem with our definition of esports, but then they provide no definition whatsoever. And so when you look at your definition, one of the key components that you list there is competitive, and I'm reading word for word from the report. Esports, this is your report, the Newzoo report. Competitive gaming at a professional level in an organized format. You talk about tournaments and leagues with a specific goal of winning, you know, prize money. And so our definition is much more broad than that. You know, it is organized competitive video gaming is how we define esports. So we're looking at the organized piece to it is that it is has oversight in it. So it relates to either a tournament or a league, but it's competitive in the sense that it's skill based. The winner is somebody who is demonstrating skill. And that's why speed running, you know, falls within that. And we could even look at it from a tiered system. You know, Tobias Schultz has a tiered, layered level of esports. We have pro esports, semi-pro esports, amateur esports, and we include all of that in our total figure. And so, based upon your definition, honestly, I see this really common in the esports industry is that there's a lot of gatekeepers in the esports industry that almost discriminate against people of a lower skill level who play video games, and I would call play esports. So, you know, in the US, we have competitive esports middle school teams. So kids that are 11 and 12, 13 years old. We have high school esports teams, collegiate esports teams. Based upon your definition, you wouldn't even call that esports because they're not professionals. However, they participate in a league. It's organized. There's a winner and loser. And so I don't even know what we would call them. You know, the Slippery Rock University video game team. So that's where we have a major issue with the difference, because you seem to really extremely narrow the definition of it. And honestly, only a handful of players would qualify as an esports player with your definition.
So you'll notice that in my definition for the purpose of this debate, I intentionally dropped the professional element, and there is a reason for that.
Interesting. That's convenient. That's really convenient.
Yeah,
I
did. We could go back and run the tape. And the reason for that is that indeed for our report, we only focus on the professional level, right? Because the vast majority of the revenues within the actual broadcast media industry, right? So when it comes to the events, when it comes to the teams, all of that is really focused on that top tier professional level. It has better tracking. It has more reliable revenue reporting. It is easier and more realistic for us to track, and is the vast majority of interest for consumer brands, for investors, for platforms, all of that, right? So it is kind of the core thrust when it comes to the value chain. If I was to talk more broadly about how I define esports, I would of course include collegiate, right? Semi-professional. Even we have definitions in some of our decks where we tag people through esports. We have definitions where you have a great kind of a circle that comes out, and in the beginning is the core game experience. You get to viewing, sharing, etc. And as you go further out, you get amateur esports, semi-professional esports, professional esports. Those are all forms of esports, right? But that is still a much more narrow section of revenue than the entire core games revenue, right? And I think you guys point to things like StarCraft is in your list as a core esports, right? So if we were to accept the premise of, well, these games revenues count, the majority of StarCraft box sales were driven by single player campaign buyers, right? People who went and they bought it and they played the single player and barely touched the multiplayer. Now, we're now allocating all of those revenues per your definition to esports when none of these people are playing in anything that resembles an organized format or even at times a competitive format, right? So again, you're wading into areas where you're capturing revenues that are not realistically part of the industry.
Yeah, the StarCraft Remer, and actually I forgot to say when I opened, I just have to thank you guys so much, Remer and Fabrice. Like, it truly is, like, it's such a joy to be debating you guys and, you know, having this conversation. And I just, you know, every time I have a dialogue like this, I'm just struck by how far the industry's come. Like, I can remember, you know, when esports was a rounding error in PC Gamer magazine. You know what I mean? It was like, look, this guy run John Carmack's car. Isn't that crazy? And like, now here we are arguing like, okay, how many billions is it? Like, but nobody's saying it's not a billion. You know, it's really incredible. And so I think it's such a great moment that this is how far our industry has come, you know, in terms of maturity and you know, intellectual rigor, right? But yeah, the StarCraft 2 point is really interesting because we struggled with exactly that. Like, we struggled so much with StarCraft 2 that how do you look at a game like that and say, okay, it has a campaign mode. Like, I'm a great example of this. I play a lot of StarCraft 2. I was scared of multiplayer. I had ladder anxiety. I didn't really do it. But we sort of had to, at the end of the day, what we said to ourselves is, look, if you're playing soccer, whether it's in your own backyard or in the World Cup, you're still playing soccer. The sport is the sport, right? And the skills you are building in your single player campaign, like whether or not to, you know, your micro and your macro, how to do your baneling busts. Sorry, I think that's StarCraft 2, so don't judge me. You know, but all of that stuff, right? Like, you know, those skills do transfer to some extent. You are practicing the same sport. And, you know, what's even harder about it is there is such, as Joseph alluded to in his opening, there's such a porous flow, right? Like, how many people at least try multiplayer, at least play it with a friend? Right? At least climb on ladder a little bit to bronze, to silver, to gold, right? Like, the break point at which you become a professional is so thin today, particularly now when anybody can create a Twitch stream and theoretically be monetizing or getting paid for their skills, even if it's a couple dollars, right? So we took the stance of, look, if it's a sport, the things you do in it are always a sport, right? And that is aggressive and that's broader, but we also think it reflects an underlying truth, which is esports have really changed games. Like, yes, they're a subset of games, but the reality is today publishers design, develop, and patch their games with a view towards competitive integrity and high skill cap development between people in a way that just didn't happen back in the Doom era or the Wolfenstein 3D era, you know. And we think that that really does set apart this category of game, and it at least deserves to be privileged somewhat. Again, we're happy to argue about throwing in individual games or not, and I think you could make great arguments. Like, CSGO is a wonderful one. We can revisit that. It's a gray area, right? The publisher totally ignores it. It feels weird to leave it out because it's a huge esport. It feels weird to leave it in because the publisher doesn't do anything with it. But again, those are individual games. The fact is, I think you need to include some games in the market size. And even if you include just one game like League of Legends, right? That did what, like 1.5 billion in 2019? Even if you include one game, it's still over the $1 billion reported by Newzoo. So I think it's, and again, I don't want to sound too critical here because I think you're right. You guys are sizing the esports market for professional events. I think that's what's being said. And that is a real market size, and that's valuable and that's important. But it's difficult to say that that's esports. And I think anyone listening to this, if you think, I mean, I'm curious, like, do you think League of Legends, $1 spent in League of Legends shouldn't count towards the esports market size? Because I think it should. And I would argue most people listening probably think it should too.
I mean, I would tell you that having worked at Riot, that Riot would not consider $1 spent in League of Legends as esports revenue, right? So when you look from the perspective of the actual publishers and the in-industry people who are looking at this industry in an actionable way, they clearly delineate between game revenues and esports revenues, right? And this is not just true for Riot, but it's true for pretty much every publisher out there. Is they look at esports revenues as the revenues they're deriving from the broadcast media product, and perhaps in some edge cases you'll include, let's say, DLC and skins that are esports derived, so esports team IP, that kind of stuff, right? But generally, if someone goes and buys a skin, even if they're a huge esports fan, and by the way, many, I would say the majority of League of Legends players are not esports fans. They don't watch the broadcast product. They don't care about the broadcast product. But they would not view a dollar spent there as an esports spend. They would view it as a game spend, right? And I think this goes back to my earlier point of when you guys talk about esports in the same way you talk about sports, I think the greater equivalency is talking about games. Because when I talk about all the revenue League of Legends generates, right, globally, I'm going to talk about the esports revenue, and I'm going to talk about the game revenue, and I'm going to talk about all the other things that they do to generate revenue. But when I'm talking about esports as an industry and games as an industry, I'm talking about the business model and the monetization of players, whether through box sales, whether through free-to-play skins, in-game content, all that kind of stuff. And when I'm going to talk about esports as an industry, I'm going to talk about the monetization of viewers as fans, particularly when it comes to competition for a game. So I'm going to be talking about sponsorships. I'm going to be talking about media rights. I'm going to be talking about ticket sales and events like that. And I think that that is a necessary delineation to have in the esports industry that you would not have in traditional sports because of how different the businesses are. And I think it's also a necessary delineation just for the practical ease of doing business in this space and understanding it properly.
If I may respond to that, I think that's great, actually. I mean, that's kind of exactly what we want to say as well. It's a matter of perspective, right? From the perspective of the publishers, they think, well, we're already making games. It's just like this is an esport part that's separate from it. But that's, of course, because you're in the publisher's perspective. It's like saying the pharmaceuticals, you say the pharmaceutical industry has all this stuff. And, a ton of research is done at universities and it's, generics and all this stuff. But the actual, from the perspective of like Pfizer, they're like, well, okay, well, our pharmaceuticals division is actually the part where we make the drugs, which is, because that's their business, right? What we're trying to do is not take the perspective of the publisher's business. We're taking the perspective of the average investor into this space, the average analyst of this space, the average, layperson who goes around and hears about what's this esports thing that I keep hearing about. We tell them, look, it's this huge, giant space.
Yeah, and if I can tag on that for a second, it really is like the investor angle that I think gave us another clue into this market sizing, because you have $1 billion of venture capital coming in every year. Like, what VC pours $1 billion a year into $1 billion market, right? It doesn't make sense, right? Intuitively, like there's no VC in the world who's like, okay, great, I'm going to put in $1 and I expect the total addressable market, the TAM of that is the exact dollar I put in. And I think that goes to the other reason why, I feel quite strongly about having a larger number. It's because it isn't just the professional side that matters. Like, I think, Remer, you'd said like it's the pro side is what's of most interest to business today and investors today. And I really disagree with that. I mean, I'll give you 2 examples that add up to $500 million, right? We have Playverse, which is high school and collegiate, which has raised almost 100 million esports. And we have Discord, which has raised almost 350 million. All of those, I would argue, are esports or esports adjacent investment, gamer adjacent investment, right? And they are 100% not narrow band products targeted at pros or consumers, right? They're pro players. They're targeted at the general base of esports consumers. And I think that kind of gives another window into our logic here, which is, look, like the vast majority of services today launching in esports and building value in esports are monetizing off of the casual players or the semi-competitive players. Even the teams generate most of their revenue from merchandising and ticket sales, which are sold to the amateur players themselves. So we kind of think like the broader view really does make sense. And it actually captures better what's going on in the industry. There's so much interest and so much growth because it's not $1 billion industry that's come into being overnight. It's a 20+ $1 billion industry that's come into being overnight. And that's why so much capital can get thrown at it. And there could be such patience from the long-term investors who back the teams or the orgs in the space.
Please respond to that, Ryan.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things to pick apart here that we need to kind of go through. I think the first one is I would challenge the idea that just because investors or VCs have put $1 billion into esports products, that means that the esports industry is only $1 billion, right? The whole concept of VCs is to accelerate growth and to build out new markets. So there's plenty of situations and opportunities where if you look at a young dynamic market where they have a firm belief in a lot of future potential monetization, just because the monetization today is $10 does not mean that you won't put 100,000 or $1 million into my industry, right? Because if you believe in my vision for what this industry is going to be and you believe the market fundamentals are favorable to it, you'll put way more than the total industry's worth. Because if you think it's going to grow 100 times, it's going to grow 100 times and it's going to be or a lot more than 100 in this case, but you get it, then it's worth it. So I think that's one thing to put aside. I want to touch on the Discord concept, because I think that if you were to take the revenue of Discord as part of the esports space, to me that feels like a dramatic overreach. Because even if you were to consider, like, even if we were to take for granted that everything that is related to esports needs to, be back into it, or games that are played as esports, again, because to me that is still a delineation that I think also a lot of people who work in industry make, which is that the game is not necessarily an esport. It's a game that has an esports scene that is played as an esport. But if you were to take that broader definition, Discord is built on, communities of so many different kinds. And maybe we can go to streaming platforms as well, like Twitch. This can be one broader discussion. But to my mind, you are now suddenly capturing, value that goes way outside of competitive gaming. I, for example, am a member of this is a very strange plug, but there's a YouTuber called Bad Seed Tech. I think he's fantastic. He does hardware review. It's like mostly like audio peripherals and like, keyboards and mice, right? And never talks about he talks a little bit about games, but predominantly the focus is on, he does very dedicated like audiophile headphone reviews. Now we're suddenly saying the value that community generates being on Discord as part of esports, is that not kind of oversizing the market at that point?
Yeah, Remer, I think that's I think that's a really wonderful point. Yeah, you're right. And again, I mean, I think we take a very expansive view. And certainly when we would put something like Discord, and we've sized it down and made adjustments to it, but we would put something like Discord in the digital tool category because it's connecting gamers and professional players. And you're right, we could perhaps be overreaching by counting the Discord revenues in there, or other platforms. Like, for example, we put coaching platforms revenue in there, right? But people don't have to get coached on esports. They could get coached on, beating a level in a single player game, right? So there's definitely areas where our market sizing has been broad. But again, I go back to the slippery slope point. It's okay, so throw some of that stuff out. Let's throw out all of Discord's revenue. What is it, like 100 million at most? I don't think they'd make a huge amount of money. It's still a drop in the bucket against the overall number we come to, which is 25 billion. And we're happy to have it chipped down to some degree, right? Like, we think it's reasonable. Why we wanted to have this debate is to figure out what does and should not belong. We put our stake in the ground, and we need experts like you to give us feedback to better refine and adjust the vision. But I think it still goes to, even if you chip aside pieces at the margin, again, there are things that I think are clearly related and clearly value driven in esports, in digital tools and connectivity. Use training software, for example, like Aim Labs, for example. I think that is clearly esports related, clearly driven. You should put something like that in there. So again, it's a slippery slope. Where we join the line, where we draw the line, we can argue over it. But I would push us to a wider and more expansive definition. I'd also just say, though, to kind of pivot a little, because I think we're very caught up in the game space, and I want to address another area of, I think, difference we have, which is, do you count prizing and the pro salaries, right? And I think here it makes the debate a little meatier too, because now we can even take a very narrow worldview, right? We could take the Newzoo worldview and say it's just the professional events and just that high tier organized competitive play. So, but I would say, even taking that worldview, then why exclude something like prizing and pro salary, which are, I think, clear, valuable inputs at the highest level of competitive play?
I mean, I guess the first thinking would be double counting, right? Because you have the teams, they get the revenues, they get the investment money, but they also get revenue from sponsorship, from league distributions, from media rights deals, from digital goods, and then they turn around and the biggest bulk of their costs is the player salaries. So now immediately you're double counting revenues in the industry, no?
Well,
William, let me step in here.
Say, oh yeah.
So Twitch made 900 million in 2019, and so based upon Newzoo's report, you included, I think, 18 million of revenues toward the industry, I believe. And Newzoo, I mean, if we just take 3% of that 900 million, we're at 27 million. So, what I guess my point is that even if you just take a very small portion of those revenues, that obviously some of that Twitch revenue comes from esports. There's no doubt about it. What percent? Don't know exactly, but you have to include some of it. And that's what we try to do is to generate, obviously, some of that revenue from outside of what is customary based upon your report. Two other quick points I want to make before I let somebody else speak. I think one of the things, based upon your methodology that you list within your report, it's very difficult to pick it apart. You're able to look, well, why did you pick that video game? Well, because in a 25-page paper, we cited academically every single thing of where we pulled our data from. And when we look at your methodology that you list on your report, and I'll read a little bit of it, it says, we incorporate data from multiple sources, macroeconomic and census data. There's no we don't know where that came from. Primary consumer research, where does that come from? No idea. Data provided by our official industry data partners and third-party research. So I just want to bring up the point that it's easy for you to try to pick apart different pieces of our paper because we academically cite where we get all of our data. And your methodology is so vague that no one could ever pick it apart individually because it's so vague. I think the last question I want to direct toward Newzoo is, I haven't seen an industry estimation as low as 1 billion. When we look at some of the other estimations that are out there, Goldman Sachs estimates the industry at 2.96 billion. Quantum estimates the industry at 4 billion. And when we're looking at projections for 2022, those same companies have an estimate that's double what Newzoo's estimate is. So when we're looking at various data points, yours tends to be less than what other people project. Even iResearch reports that the Chinese esports industry alone in 2019 was based at $18 billion as a market size. So I guess my question is that based on all these other citations that I've just provided, where they estimate the market being much even double or significantly more than it, why are all these other people estimating the market much larger than Newzoo?
Sure, I'd be happy to tackle that. I'll say before I joined and we did our first revenue model revamp where we actually lowered our projections, we were criticized by industry insiders as being too high previously at 1.1 billion for 2019, let alone these other ones. The other thing I'll point out is that I believe, so Fabrice, you might have the exact number, but I think it's somewhere like 44% of our model actually comes from actuals, whether it's public or privately shared from our data partners, so esports teams, for example, who give us their revenue numbers quarter by quarter. We then plug that in with certain market fundamentals to build our own model, right? So the reason we don't cite other academic pieces is because we're actually building on actuals and things like viewership data and attendance and databases that we maintain to build a model to construct how much using the fundamental revenue drivers, which are eyes and attendance, right, to build a model of what that actual industry looks like, right? And I'm not trying to attack specific games because I think we are also, well, we may not cite, I'm not attacking your citations, I'm simply going through the boundaries through which you are sizing the market. And we do provide similar boundaries for what we include and do not include. We clearly define what we consider relevant in the esports industry. We take you through the games, the events, the tournaments, and we give you the fundamentals and the building blocks through which we build our own models, right? So I think it's unfair to say, well, we just hocus pocus and we get a number, especially when you consider just the amount of our model that actually comes from actuals. I'm forgetting what the first point was, but I know someone else wants to go because I was forgetting what else I wanted to say.
I have to interrupt slightly. Oh, Fabrice hasn't spoken, please.
Oh yeah, I the only thing I quickly want to add, I think in the beginning you mentioned Twitch revenues, which I'm not sure where, we don't really include those anywhere in our esports revenues. We have, however, in the past have had these as advertising revenues in our model, but I think we removed those, I think a year ago. We removed basically advertising revenues from Twitch.
So yeah, I actually want to jump on that. There is actually rationale for that. So Twitch, for example, we actually very specifically remove the advertising revenues from Twitch for esports sections because to our mind, it is again double counting, right? So if we look at the core value drive, we're saying, so the esports industry that is producing the content is receiving a media rights disbursement from Twitch. They're paying, for example, the LEC or the LCS or Overwatch League. Well, I guess no longer Overwatch League, that's YouTube now, but you get the idea. They're receiving a very specific disbursement, a payment, a fee for the value that it is inputting that platform. Now, the delta between the advertising revenue that Twitch gets from playing that and the amount they pay out to the distributors is essentially how you would economically allocate the value of the platform, which is not the value of the esport. To count all of the Twitch revenue and then all of the actual media rights is, again, an issue of double counting to our minds.
Well, I kind of want to return to the double counting point, particularly around the prizing and the player salaries, because I think that really is important. And I think that goes to maybe a more subtle methodological difference between our approaches, which is something Joseph alluded to, this GDP approach, right? Because, if you look at GDP in any sizing of a traditional market, there's this concept that money moves, right? Like when I spend $1 and you get $1, the dollar doesn't disappear. You can then spend that dollar, right? And entire branches of economic analysis like monetarism are actually based around the theory that that dollars move, like it's money supply times velocity, right? What we're thinking here is, look, yes, it's 100% true that when a team gets revenue, they pay the pro, right? And that dollar doesn't disappear, though. It's the same thing as a GDP analysis, right? That dollar moves to the pro, and then the pro can spend it on something else. And we are careful in our model to distinguish between what we would call like a pass-through income in a traditional type of business where it's literally money passing through an entity, like a prizing distribution through an org to a player. We eliminate that. But in the reality, you have two economic engines in esports. You have the pro gamers who the teams play to compete for, and you have the teams who build brands and monetize around that. And just because one of those economic engines is paying the other economic engine to participate doesn't mean you should exclude them from the overall analysis of the industry or the value and opportunity they create. And I just return to intuition here, right? Like, if you think that the market size of professional esports shouldn't include what professional esports players get paid, I'd argue that just feels a little unintuitive. Like that's certainly not what I would expect to be in a market size number for the industry.
What I'll do is I just want to move on because we are struggling for time. One thing that I did notice and wanted to bring up from both parties is a slightly awkward part of this debate is in the same month the $1 Billion Myth article was published, all the major esports media companies released that in October was a record month for investment of approximately 300 million, which really makes the whole conversation strained. So what seems obvious to me is future reports really must include what they do not include in their analysis. Otherwise, everyone gets into a bit of a tangle. People can respond to that, but I did want to move the conversation on to somewhere a bit harder, which is where are clear areas of inaccuracy in stated numbers? We're living in a world of lots of numbers, but where are people getting their numbers wrong?
I mean, I'll jump into that on our side. I really don't think we have issue with any of the analysis Newzoo did. Like, they're great. They're an awesome company full of super smart people. I don't think any of us think Newzoo made a math error or something. That's crazy. I think our real difference is what we're discussing here, which is what do you put in the bucket? Which buckets do you count, right? I don't think anybody is saying, oh, they didn't measure the bucket accurately. And I think Newzoo's far too respected and insightful of a publication for that ever. So just to be very clear, I don't want that to be the assumption behind this at all. But I don't know. I mean, yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I said I promise I won't do this, but I mean, it's not that we don't take any issue methodologically. We're sure that they're consistent with their internal definitions, but it's more a matter of, for example, that they have like Ninja makes had like a $20 million deal, exclusivity deal. I'm sorry, this is the wrong example. So like the international, right? The Dota 2 is international thing, right? They had $30 million worth of cosmetic sales for this, and that's $30 million in pricing, of which it was calculated by 25% of all sales for this event. So Dota 2 alone, the international, the final series alone, generated $120 million of revenue for Riot. Now you could argue Riot would certainly classify the remaining 75% as game revenue, but because it was tied to the international, it was promoted as your revenue goes to the international pricing revenue. You get $120 million in the space, from that alone, and that is, the entire Newzoo, pricing space for this. So, again, it's not that we think Newzoo is wrong from the assumption that they did and the calculations that they did. We're sure they're brilliant. Like we know that they're really brilliant, so they did that right. It's, again, philosophical, different. Like, how come the numbers don't add up?
So actually, it's Valve you're referring to, not Riot, but
I'm sorry, Valve.
point taken. And in that case, actually, we agree. I think that's a very clearly dedicated esports product that is sold digitally that we would like to capture. We actually say in our report that we only include the team side. Now, the reason for that is that unfortunately, publishers will not give us any data to build a model on esports digital goods. As you know, publishers do not like to share data. So thus far, we have not been able to get any kind of foundational inputs with which to size the rest of the market. We have one, obviously, with that one, and maybe we could tease out a couple others, but there's so many products that are, let's say, esports oriented that that don't get shared back to teams that publishers put out and sell. And that is actually an area where we agree. We would love to see that captured. Just for our purposes, we do not think that we do not have enough inputs to create a reliable model to feed that back to the industry. So that's why we don't capture.
So if I could just quickly respond to that. I mean, I think philosophically, in many ways, we all agree. It's kind of like where we set up the fences, right? You set up the fences for stuff that you're like absolutely 100% sure about. We're like, let's extend it to where we think that there's flow of at least like 50 to 70%, right? Let's extend it out to see if there's that kind of relationship with each other. Let's see where the boundaries are, and then we know, how far we can go.
I think
Sure.
that's actually a kind of what I wanted to mention about the whole conversation we're having here is it's mostly coming from kind of more the data side of things and kind of building out our models. I think one issue is in the esports space in general is availability of a lot of information or a lot of data is just not that readily and publicly or easily accessible, especially compared if you compare it to something like the games industry where you have a lot of public companies and you have a lot of more information on it. I think it becomes a lot easier or simpler to kind of pinpoint, okay, these are all the revenue streams. And I think, like you basically mentioned right now, and I think that's correct, is we take an approach where we kind of try to figure out, okay, do we really capture the entire space here? So are we really kind of certain that we are covering kind of everything we at least define in our definition? And I think that's also why, for example, if you look at some of the revenue streams we implement in our numbers, is we've extended those. I think last year we basically extended some additional revenue streams and we tried to kind of cover more and more spaces as kind of we get more data available. So I think one at least limitation there is, and that kind of will always be there at least for the foreseeable future, is just generally tracking and data and availability in the esports space.
And just to tag on quickly, I do agree that there are areas where I think we could capture more. Like you said, I think things that are very specifically esports digital products would be great to be able to capture. I think having a better grip on I think having a better grip on the full size of collegiate and let's say participatory esports, like organized competition that's built around people playing. Now, I think the revenues generated from that are going to be fairly small relative to the overall market, but we would love to capture it. I think we still stand by the position that I think once you start to include game revenues, and I keep being told it's a slippery slope argument. I think it's not. I think and maybe this comes from the fact that I used to worked on formats and used to make rules. So I'm somewhat literal about creating these boundaries. But to me, I think at that point, you do include the entire games industry and all peripheral industries around it. And not as a slippery slope, just organic. Because I think every game can be an esport, right? I cannot think of, or almost every, but I cannot really off the top of my head think of a game that I could not make into an esport. And so for me, I think that's something worth sizing as well. And maybe there's an argument for a intrinsically competitive games market, right? And maybe that is where the area is. But again, I look to the actionability of definitions. And if the industry standard is focused on that organized competition through a tournament format, that is this part of the industry and the value derived out of that we want to capture.
And I'll just add on to that. Actually, two areas where we were in agreement was that we could not find accurate data on esports gambling as well as fantasy esports. And so, really our number should be higher when it comes to $25 billion valuation. And that was one of the things where it was interesting that a few people in social media were critical of us that we didn't include esports gambling into our figure. Because you guys are Newzoo, were you ever contacted and say, it's crazy that you give a valuation without including gambling? And that's something that has been, that's part of your report that you're very clear about, and we were very clear about that. So our valuation actually should be higher than 25 billion, but we weren't able to find accurate numbers on that.
Yeah, gambling is always interesting. I think for safety purposes, I'm not going to comment too much on gambling in general, just because it's always a sensitive topic, and being in the private sector, I need to be considerate of all sides of the issue. But there is something, gambling is a whole another peripheral industry where, as you mentioned, I mean, if you take a very broad definition of what you're going to, let's say broad maybe sounds dismissive. I don't want to sound condescending or dismissive. Again, I respect your work, but if you take a wider, let's say a wider scope of what you want to capture when you're talking about the industry and what you're driving value, there is a very good argument to be made that gambling fits in it. Although I do fear and suspect that, especially if you look at our scope, if you insert gambling into the esports market, it suddenly becomes a very, very large part of the market, at which point it's more of a gambling report than an esports report. But these are sometimes the realities of the space.
Yeah, I will just say, the common theme here being availability of data, right? And academic research being based on continuous improvement. If people are listening to this and, like they read the paper, they read the Newzoo report, and they have ideas, because the data is so difficult to come by. For us, for example, in our report, we had to do a lot of top-down sizing rather than bottom-up that I think we would have preferred. Like, this is a real debate that you could contribute to. Like, there is much more material research that can be done here. There's much more granularity in the sizing and the breakdown. I mean, we're even agreeing about some areas of it here right now. So I would say to the listeners of this, like, take this as an opportunity. If you're watching this debate and you think it's interesting, like, you can help. And I'd shout out to Dr. Aaron here, and the IJE, right? Like, it's a phenomenal publication for esports academic research. Like, you can write something and submit it and join this debate as well. That's certainly how Joseph and Seth and I ended up being here, right?
Or reach out to us. We'd love to keep writing about this space and keep expanding our view with the help of people like Remer and viewers like you.
Did we have quite a few questions? Did anyone have anything else they wanted to make sure was said in this debate? I guess not.
Nothing.
Great. That's a good sign. So the first question that we received was we're really talking about esports as a whole, when really it's a number of constituent parts, especially in terms of region. So the question is, how has the accelerated growth of esports within different regions translated into the value of the industry as a whole?
Sorry, one more time. I sort of missed the first part.
I'll simplify. Essentially, they're asking, how is the regionality of esports income or value manifested in the total number?
Oh yeah, I mean, so if you go into, again, so unfortunately this is not free, but if you go into our global esports market report, the full version, we do actually break out market by market projections of sizing. And it is true, is that esports is interesting because you have markets that are really divided by a quasi-regional linguistic basis, right? So even though Europe doesn't really have the same language, it tends to be a little bit more unified in how it behaves. And then it still has some ties with America as another English-speaking market, but time zones and regionality means slightly different set of teams, different fandoms, slightly different tribalism. Then you have Latin America, which is divided into Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Latin America, and even in Asia, right? China really acts as its own market, and Korea does, and Japan does, right? And so what's really interesting is when you're trying to size a market and you're going from, let's say, a bottom-up approach, as William mentioned, you have to sort of get real data from each of these markets, because these markets are going to behave differently. They're going to have different levels of development. They're going to have different levels of enthusiasm and investment, right? You're going to have a different nature. Like the US market has a long storied history of just generally monetizing sports media. And that's translated somewhat easily into esports media. I mean, 3 of the top 4 most valuable leagues in the world are American, right? It's all in one country. We've got 500 million people in Europe, and we don't have 4 of the top 5. That singular market also makes ease of investment, right? So you might be able to more efficiently monetize a viewer in North America than you could in another wealthy market like Europe, simply because of the division of the marketing budget and a different tradition around sports monetization, right? And places like China, there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. And so as you go through the markets, what you really see is that in each of these markets, you'll have some similarities and commonalities, but you'll have different games that are valued. You'll have sometimes different organizers, different teams, different heroes, and different sponsors. And so the businesses become very different when you look at what's popular in Brazil, like Garena Free Fire, versus what's popular in Germany, where it's League of Legends and CSGO. It's just a different scene.
Okay. Did the academic group want to add anything to that?
We didn't do a regional division. For that, actually, we probably would literally go to Newzoo and say, what do you think the division is regionally?
Yeah,
Well,
very, very well said, Remer.
Then we'd add a bunch of zeros at the end of the figure.
So the next question is a bit trickier, I think. It's asking about GDP. How are we calculating business investment and government expenditure or taxation related to esports?
That's an excellent question. Well, there's no real government expenditure or taxation in this space right now. Business investment is captured sort of implicitly in terms of like, for example, the multi-year deals that are locked into people, which would demand an upfront payment. But we don't actually encode for strict investment. This is a slightly not a great answer, but there is a very good reason I didn't include the word GDP in our original paper, or the phrase GDP in our original paper, because it is not a GDP strictly. I illustrated that to more talk about, I said that to more talk about how it's a combination of the major value chains that exist in this space. The major value chains that drive the events, that drive the streaming, the actual goods, the digital goods, and all that kind of stuff. And so, maybe the next time we actually will do a straight GDP approach. But no, again, this is more about from an investor's perspective coming in, and you see this large space with myriad opportunities. What kind of value chains do you invest in? What kind of value chains do you think would lead to your growth? Where do you move as a strategic actor? That kind of thing.
Okay, did Newzoo want to add anything to that?
I mean, we don't take as much of a GDP approach, if you will, right? We're really focused on the core media value chain. So I think it's less pertinent for us.
Great. The next question was related to what we already discussed, which was around gambling or betting. The question is, do other sports organizations take into account, or are we making up a new rule here?
To the best of my knowledge, typically with sports industry sizing, I believe they don't. But again, this isn't I believe. So if someone says, actually, I have the proof right here, I will have pie on my face, right? So I don't want to say it's 100%, but I'm pretty confident I've looked at this before and found they do not. I mean, I do also go back to the idea that I think we should set our own rules for esports, legislatively and also in market sizing and how we think about it. We can learn from sports, but not to take that as gospel, because I think we'll run into mistakes. Actually, quick tangent. I forget, someone made a really great point where they're talking about people who come into esports and they want to do sports. And they basically said, look, sports already exists. If we wanted our culture to be sports, we would be sports fans, not esports fans. And I think it's a good perspective, right? That this is a place where we want to do our own thing a little bit. As far as I'm aware, it does not occur. I think that people like to be focused more on the value chain of the activity itself, and things that enable and facilitate the activity, not, let's say, secondary, tertiary businesses around it. But
If I can just quickly respond from at least from my perspective as well. I mean, so as far as I understand, Remer is correct again, that esports, I think sports strictly doesn't include gambling. But I want to highlight a larger point here, which is that just like esports is digital and YouTube is digital, again, these digital things erode some of these boundaries. So there are startups out there where people can bet against each other, like literally in LAN centers. There's startups out there where people bet in real time as they play along with the game. There's all kinds of, again, it's not like you are either a player or a bookie. It's or a client for a bookie. It's all kind of mingling again. And again, that's I think a common theme with a lot of these digital things, and especially esports.
Yeah, I think a great example of that is like amateur real money betting, right? So it's like, as you're mentioning, these sites where people literally they bet on themselves. So they go and they bet against other people and they play them and they try and win. And then where does that fall, right? I think it's a great example of lines blurring. Where is that esports? Is that gambling? Is that gambling esports? Is that gambling sports? I don't know. Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and then I want to break the rules a bit. I want each of you to think of one question you want to ask the opposing group to finish off. So
we'll just do two on our end because they just have two.
Yes, of course, in terms of fairness. So the question from the audience member is, returning to what we discussed, which is around speedrunning. Is speedrunning an esport? How would we calculate it if it is?
I would say yes. Why not? If it has an organized competition, if it's got competitive integrity, and if people are competing for a title, such as the world's fastest Half-Life 2 clearer, right, or whatever game it wants to be, right? For world's fastest Half-Life Alex player, all right, it's in VR. It's a whole new thing. Now, if that has competitive integrity, it's a game of skill, and it's played with the purpose of winning. I think it's absolutely can be an esport, particularly if it's broadcast and has an audience, or at least has some sort of participatory audience. But yeah.
I take it the academic group completely agree with that answer then?
Yeah, 100%. I think we said that in the upfront. Like, speedrunning should be counted. I think for us, it's harder, so we get it in a couple different ways, largely indirectly. We do some kind of residual sizing on games revenue, for example, where speedrunning would be captured, because again, it is difficult to measure it directly. But again, this goes to what I said. If you're listening and you're looking for a research topic, that would be a fascinating research topic to dive deeper into. And you could look at the Newzoo report and what we've written in the IGE as a starting point for future analysis.
Great. Well, if you can Remer or Fabrice just ask a question they would like to ask the academics just to finish off.
Fabrice, you're up.
I'm actually trying to think of something.
Yeah, I am as well.
I can start off if they need a second to.
Yeah, go for it, Seth.
What I'm curious to know is, behind the scenes, when our paper came out, did Newzoo have internal discussions, and did you think like, hey, maybe we should reevaluate the way that we define esports? And has the paper made any potential impact on moving forward with your subsequent reports relating to the valuation of the industry as a whole?
So yeah, I'll be honest, we did not hear about it until we were forwarded the email from Aaron where we saw it and we shared it around. And it was an interesting discussion point. I think the internally we were pretty aligned that we go back to the idea that once you start to include a lot of the revenues you're including, you're looking at the games industry as a whole at that point. I think that stands to be our position. It's just at the end of the day, I think we also have slightly different goals, right? For you guys are academics. You're there to search for what you feel to be an equitable truth. For us, we are in the private sector, and our goal is to service our clients in the way they understand the industry, and also to push forward this market sizing in a way that's actionable for the people who are looking in the industry as it's generally understood endemically and in the people they'll talk to, right? So for us, we do stand by our definition in that sense, but we did appreciate the alternative perspective, and it definitely sparked interesting conversation internally.
So are you dropping professional from your definition?
I don't think so.
Like you did in this debate?
Honestly, the thing is, we might, but I want to change that definition a little bit, how it is in the report in general, just a little bit. I think it needs some tweaking on the edges. I think in the report we don't have the competitive integrity part in there. I want to put that in there, and maybe we do drop the professional. I don't think professional is as important as it being for an audience or some kind of organized format, right? That I think is the more defining parts for me.
And I think the professional part from our side also comes in, and that's my focus. So that's what I'll mention again, is kind of the data availability and kind of how we collect data and what kind of data is available out there. I think something like collegiate esports is super interesting, and I think we would love to kind of cover more. But it's just such a new space inside the esports space that it's just very hard, sometimes quite difficult to capture. And kind of also to add on kind of quickly answering your question, I think especially for me at least, I think this debate was actually quite interesting in terms of kind of different angles of how to view the esports space. And I understand all of the points you guys mentioned, I think are super interesting. And I'm actually kind of, thinking about them myself a lot as well. I think for now, at least, I think we're staying with our numbers. And I think we all agree that none of the numbers are in any way wrong. It's just kind of how you view and how you scope out the entire space. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about. And I think, both Remer and me and anyone else at Newzoo, we always try to kind of improve our numbers, think about them differently. And I think, a lot of the points you guys brought up, I think are interesting talking points for us in the future.
I guess one question for you guys is, since the publication of the article, is there any way in which you guys thinking has evolved? Because obviously some time has passed, right? Is there anything where you guys view maybe something slightly differently from what's been published, or is that still all identically the same?
I mean, so I would say that ours has evolved somewhat. I mean, we still stand by the kind of our side of things. Sort of behind the scenes, the information on some of the league sizing was very helpful, which we just didn't really have data for. You can look at the paper where we kind of discussed that. Definitely, we would try and include wagering or gambling. And we also would have tried to include mobile esports. So recently there's this game called Honor of Kings that grossed 1.7 billion. We didn't really include that in our list of esports games, but this is obviously a huge segment that we feel ought to be included. So definitely things that I think we can plug here and there and improve. But our feeling is actually maybe our gut is that actually maybe our number is too low overall. Yeah.
Honor of Kings, also PUBG Mobile and Garena Free Fire are all incredible. Because Honor of Kings is Arena of Valor in the West, for people who are not familiar. Honor of Kings in China, Arena of Valor elsewhere. Those are all super interesting things in terms of just the growth of mobile esports and what's happening, particularly in these developing markets. It's very exciting. Absolutely, I think capturing, if you're going to talk about esports at this point in 2020, I think you have to capture games like that as well.
Well, I think that's a fabulous way to end the debate. I have to say thank you very much to everyone involved. I'm getting a lot of messages saying I didn't introduce myself. I apologize. My name is Aaron Koshy. I'm the chief editor of the International Journal of Esports, which is the leading academic journal for esports research. We genuinely do welcome submissions of all types of articles relating to esports research from anyone, regardless of your background. We just look for quality. I have to thank everyone here for being incredibly respectful and incredibly insightful into their subject matter. Really, really thrilled that we could get this partnership with ESI to get as many eyeballs on this debate, and we really look forward to doing a few more of these in the future. Thank you very much to everyone involved.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, everybody.
It was fun.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, everyone.
I'm going to enjoy a whiskey now.
Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was